children also, yes.
On the 5th day of the Battle of the Way, the Marines moved out of the fortified Army compound next to the original attack and advanced into the empty, abandoned buildings of what was Way University.
We were making plans to defend ourselves because the situation was getting quite hopeless, and we were preparing to die honorably.
War is partly madness, mostly insanity, and the rest of it's schizophrenia. You do ask yourself, why am I here? What is my purpose? What's this got to do with photography? And it goes on, the questioning. You're trying to stay alive, you're trying to take pictures, you're trying to justify your presence there, and you think, what good is this going to do anyway? These people have already been killed. There were many battles within my own mind before I got to these major conflicts. And when I got there, I was even more confused. I try to stay calm. I try not to indulge myself in this picture taking. You know, it was something I was meant to do, but you know, how far was I allowed to take it? You know, there was a lot of hypocrisy spinning around inside my own mind at the time. I didn't really think it was right to be there, because I sometimes felt that the people who were doing these terrible things thought, you know, that I was okaying it, of which I certainly wasn't. The first execution I ever saw in my life was a dawn execution of a bomber who'd killed a load of people in the Saigon market a few weeks before. And there was all these photographers and journalists were all on this jeep. You couldn't get another man on, and there was nowhere I could see. But I saw the event. They brought the man in a Volkswagen truck, and he got out and screamed anti-Americans. The firing squad shot him. A man stepped forward, grabbed a tuft of his hair and shot him through the brains. And I stood there with my mouth wide open, and I heard a man saying, "God, that was great stuff. Did you get it? Did you get it?" And I've never forgotten to this day, and that was in 1965, and I didn't get it. And I never said anything about this situation to the people in the Sunday Times, because they would have thought I must have been, you know, a rank amateur not to have got such a picture. But looking back, you know, did I have the right to take that man's picture of his murder? Because in a way, public executions are nothing less than murder, and I didn't get the picture.
Now, you came from a fairly rough background, didn't you, in London? It seems an unlikely ambition to have, your first ambition, to be a painter. Was that regarded as a bit sissy?
Well, yes, it was, because where I lived, you were expected to take on anybody. You'd never back down from an argument. I used to get some terrible hidings when I was a boy. But my father, when he was alive, he used to let me draw on the kitchen wall. And I used to actually stick pieces of paper on the wall, but I went over the edge, so there was always empty pictures with marvelous edges. And, I lived in a house that was a tenement house, so we could knock huge nails in the walls and stick things on the walls and things like that. I wouldn't let my kids do it now, but my art career didn't last very long because I got a junior art scholarship and my father died and I had to go to work.
Come on, pretty baby, let's move it and groove it. Yeah, shake, oh baby, shake, my honey, please don't lose it. The rhythm that gets into your heart and soul. Let me tell you, baby, it's called rock and roll.
I took a set of pictures of the boys I grew up with. They were involved in the killing of a policeman. They didn't actually kill the policeman. The rival gang that came from Islington, they were responsible for that killing. So I took the photos to the Observer. They asked me to do more. I did more. They published the photos, gave me the princely sum of £50. And in those days, £50 from where I came from was like about 5 weeks' wages, you know. And then I suppose you could say I was on the road to photography then, which has been a lifelong love affair. It's been really an amazing experience for me. Because you've got to remember, I didn't have any education, I couldn't read properly. I came from a violent background where people were mostly interested in how well you could fight or steal or do harm to society. So, quite honestly, you know, having this amazing door opening and someone saying, you know, there's your freedom from ignorance and bigotry and violence, you know, it was amazing. I managed to escape from Finsbury Park.
But I've often wondered, how did he get that first memorable urban landscape of the lads, the gang, the governors as they were called, in East London, standing in a derelict house, perfectly framed by the building and seeing right through the building? It was so emblematic of gang warfare and the roughness of London. And here we have a picture which is almost beautiful in its composition. You could say there's no beauty in what this gang was up to, but he related, he had a sensitivity. And empathy is something you can't fake.
This is the bloke I gave the good hiding to. He tried to hit me with a brick. We'd all been to a funeral. One of the local girls had committed suicide, put her head in the gas oven over some bloke I grew up with. We came back from the funeral and he ran past my car and snapped the wing mirror off. And he was peeing in this alleyway. That's when I should have really laid in him while he was peeing, because, you know, it's difficult to fight back if you're in a situation like that. And then he picked a brick up and come roaring at me, and then I managed to get hold of it and reverse the charges. Wasn't I lucky to have grown up in a period of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when it was all happening? It was as if, like, it was carved out for me, really. And yeah, I did grasp the kind of nettle. I did it. I didn't just look at it and think, God, I wish I was there. I used to say, I'm going to go there. And I did, you know.
Paris in the spring of 1961, at the time of President Kennedy's visit, was as beautiful as ever.
I was in Paris with my wife, my new wife, really. We'd only been married a few weeks. And I was like a fish out of water, really, because I couldn't speak the language. And whilst we were in Paris, I saw somebody reading a newspaper, and there was a photograph of an East German soldier jumping over some barbed wire, which was only at that stage separating them from the West. Of course, the story had been building up, the tension had been building up. And I looked at this photograph, and it was a memorable picture. And I said to her, when we get back to England, knowing I'd only had £70 in my savings account, I said, would you mind if I went to Berlin? And she said, of course I don't mind.
The East Germans don't seem to have guards enough to plug every hole. When a soldier's attention is diverted by others, a hole is cut in the barbed wire and Khrushchev's face is slapped again.
I rang the Observer newspaper and they said, we're not interested in you going. And I said, well, I bought the ticket. There was no commission, so I got near to a place called Friedrichstrasse, which was the center of all the problem. You know, the Americans were facing the Russians, and there were tanks facing each other. And at that stage in Friedrichstrasse, they were actually building the beginnings of the Berlin Wall. This was really the right place to be.
Camera crews are harassed by reflecting mirrors in the hands of East German police, and water hoses are played on equipment. Nevertheless, our reporters are able to come up with some remarkable pictures, despite these hazards.
My camera equipment wasn't very good, actually. I had a camera I bought during my time in the Air Force. It was totally the wrong shape to give me the kind of pictures that I needed. But nevertheless, I stretched the use of this camera, kneeling down and holding it up high and doing all kinds of funny things with it. By the time, you know, I'd been there a few days, that wall went up pretty fast and people could not escape, you know. And I looked at East German soldiers leaning out of buildings on the other side of the wall with binoculars and looking right at me. And I thought, you know, they can't hurt me because they're over there and I'm here. But it was very exciting because it was the heightened part of the Cold War where the Russians were quite prepared to make a stand, you know, against the West and vice versa. What it really comes down to is that I was really sitting on top of the most important news story in the world, you know. And it was my decision, this intuition that took me there in the first place. So I was beginning to show signs of having a brain that was functioning in the right direction. I came back to England with the film and got it processed in the Observer's darkroom, and they saw the pictures. And they ran half a page of my story. The story was then entered into the news category for the news pictures of the year, and I won this award. And the Observer gave me a contract after that. So I started getting better jobs at the Observer. I started going to all kinds of political rallies and things. And I would go to the East End of London and photograph disturbances with Oswald Mosley and situations like that. It was a developing and an expanding situation for the early part of my career.
Tinderbox, that is Cyprus, threatens to erupt into a full-scale war. Greek students demonstrate against British and U.S. proposals that a force of NATO troops help maintain a truce on the island until differences between Greeks and Turks can be resolved.
I walked into the Observer office one day and the editor said to me, "How would you consider going to cover the civil war for us in Cyprus?" And at that point of my life, I was ready. And I felt that when I think about those words, I think I must have been levitating, you know. I felt as if I was rising off the ground. I knew that the second door was opening.
Terror of civil war struck Cyprus in December. On Boxing Day, the British came in to stop the bloodshed.
So I thought, I'm going to do my best here and I'm going to make an impression, you know, this is my big chance. So I went to the Turkish community, and they were surrounded by the Greeks. I managed to slip past the roadblocks and get in. I could hear gunfire, and that was the first time I'd heard in my life hostile gunfire. And then suddenly, out of a cinema, burst a man with a machine gun, and he had a raincoat on and a flat hat, and he looked like something like a Sicilian mafioso bandit. And then people ran out with mattresses on their heads, women and children, as if a mattress would stop a bullet. And this was my baptism of war. And I had to assess very quickly what was going on, where the fire was coming from. And as the day wore on, we were trapped in these empty streets, and there were groups of fighters, Turkish defenders, And funny, curious things caught my eye. I could remember a group of men behind barricades. It was almost like the Spanish Civil War, really. And by the barricade, there were men with an ill-assorted bunch of weapons and old, almost muskety-looking kind of museum pieces. But standing near this group of men was a beautiful dog. I thought, why is it that these things come to you, you know, when you should be thinking about more serious things? But to be truthful, these little things sometimes tell you much more about, you know, a story than the obvious things. So I think what I'm getting down to here is we're talking about sensitivity. And what I had to realize at the time, I was learning a new trade. I was learning about the price of humanity and its sufferings.
Now, 4 months later, the armed forces of both sides are still defying the UN's attempts to keep the peace. And the Cyprus situation is as dangerous and complex as ever. The UN is powerless to do anything that would really help restore law and order.
I saw a whole village trying to evacuate because they were being attacked to somewhere with more safety, like a school building. And there was this one old lady who was lame, and she had 2 sticks, and she really couldn't get those legs moving, and there was a British soldier trying to coax her along and, you know, persuade her to hurry up before she'd probably lose her life. And I was with a friend of mine. I said, this is ridiculous. And I took one picture of the soldier and the old lady, and I put my cameras down, and I scooped this old lady up in my arms, and it's like scooping up some rag doll that had fallen out of a child's pram. I just ran and ran with her. I don't know why I did it, but I didn't really want to see that old lady get shot down and killed. And I went back to my position, so to speak, as a photographer, and I started carrying on. But it made me feel good, you know, it made me feel as if I wasn't just there as some voyeur that was enjoying other people's, you know, misery and possible deaths. It's a very fine line. I've been constantly accused of taking terrible pictures, and people saying, "Did you ever help anyone?" Of course I did, but you know, I don't want to brag about it. It's just I did it sometimes to clear my own conscience. These little battles are erupting all over the northern part of the island of Cyprus where the Turks live. I saw this soldier and he said, "Oh, looking for bodies," and I said, "No, but what's happening?" He said, "Well, there's been some killing." He said, "There's a dead body up there," he said, "and then there's some more in that house." I knocked on the door, I tapped on this door, there was no answer, and I let myself in, and the first thing I was greeted with was warm blood. These men had been murdered the day before, and the warm early morning sunlight had penetrated through the glass door of this house. And I closed the door and I tiptoed around the room, and I got myself in a corner and I was taking the first shot, and suddenly the door opened, and to my horror the whole family burst in. And I thought, my God, they're going to be really cross finding me in here. To my astonishment, they weren't, so I carried on photographing. And there was a woman who started screaming like mad, and the truth was that it was her husband who was just below my feet, who was dead, and a new husband at that. They'd only been married a week, and the Greeks came the day before and attacked this community and murdered these people in cold blood in this house. I went to a village one day, and I got there in the early morning, and they were finding bodies of Turkish men who were defending the villages. And then they were coming back to the village and telling the women that their husbands had been killed. And then you saw these Goya-esque kind of poses of people looking up to Christ. Or, you know, I've noticed that a lot in wars, that when people are in deep grief and emotion, they look up as if they can see God himself there, you know, offering them some help. And you see that in Goya's drawings. Before men are being shot or massacred, they look up or they're praying, and it's part of that religious nature of the great painters.
That moment is so classic. I call it one of the decisive moments in photography, because it combines the news moments with the compositional elements which make a photograph in themselves. So there is something, a second or two would have made a difference. I asked Don how he took the picture, and as I recall it, he actually had to fall to his knees quickly to get it, because he could just sense it was coming.
I mean, okay, I talk as if there's a lot of poetry in me. There isn't. I'm a photographer. I'm neither an artist or a poet. I'm a photographer. And one of the things I've learned most of all, over and above photography, the very best qualifications you can have when you're in this situation and you're exercising this duty as a photographer or whatever reporter, is that it's much better to be on the side of humanity. All this was coming at me so fast, this responsibility. And I thought, almost in the word go, I got a grip of it, and I thought, I understand what I'm doing for the first time. I'm meant to be doing this. There was a decree put out that journalists were not allowed to leave Libreville. And then I thought, here I am, I'm all this way out here in the Congo, and now I can't even leave the capital. So I had it in mind, and I knew there were mercenaries operating up in a place called Stanleyville. I quickly managed to discover all this.
I've been appointed by Mr. Chombe to recruit a number, which I can't disclose, of men to form a fighting unit in the Congo to dispel the present rebellion. Mercenary is a dirty word. This unit is going to change the meaning of that word, and mercenary will now be a badge of honor rather than a dirty word in the English language.
And I met one of these mercenaries, and his name was Alan Murphy. And I said, could you get me some information about this? And, you know, and I pumped him for how to get there. And he said, what happens was that every morning a C-130 American plane under the CIA would take groups of mercenaries, you know, to Stanleyville. And I said, could you get me one of your shirts and a pair of trousers? And if I sleep overnight in the hotel, would you just kick my bed in the morning when you get the call to leave? And he did just that. And I see myself now, 40 years ago, standing on that runway with the early morning rain shower that had passed, and a man with a clipboard who happened to be a CIA man asking people's names. And I thought, I've had it, you know. And he came up to me and he said, what's your name? And I said, McCullin. He said, you're not on the list. And I said, I should be. And my legs were like jelly. And he said, he wrote my name down. He said, okay, climb aboard. And I'd cracked this amazing no-go situation. lived in Stanleyville, I could hear a lot of shouting and screaming and people crying and gunfire. And I saw gangs of boys who'd been tied up and they were being beaten and shot in the back of the head and kicked into the river. And I was looking at all this. I had my little camera in my bag and 20 rolls of film, and I thought, how am I going to bring my camera out now and declare that I shouldn't be here and I'm not a mercenary? Because it was a huge gamble. And it was the Congolese gendarmerie who were killing these people, torturing them, dragging them behind trucks on wires. It was really terrible. They were skinned alive, some of them. There was a kind of wood yard, and they were sitting in the corner shivering and, you know, knowing that any moment they would be shot. And then they dragged some of these boys out in front of me and started, you know, brutalizing them. And I have no power, by the way, to prevent this. And I took a few pictures and I walked away. I thought, you know, you have a moral sense of purpose and duty. You have to work out which of those purposes and duty you're there for. It's very difficult to... You want to take this picture and you want to stop it. And it's a very difficult thing. It came up more and more in my life, seeing people executed in front of me. There was a man called Mike Hoare who was battling on the other side of this river called the Luralaba. He was in charge of 5th Commando, these mercenaries I teamed up with. So I arrived on the other side, and then Mike Hoare, came to me and said, "What are you doing? Who are you? Where have you come from?" And I said, "Well, I have to be clean with you now. I'm working for the Observer newspaper." He wouldn't have understood the German magazine quick. I immediately fell back on my English heritage. So he said, "I'll deal with you in the morning. I'm going to hand you over to the Congolese military," which one knew right away that would be curtains. He said, "You know, I admire what you've done, but I don't condone it." And then he totally switched his whole kind of attitude and you know, offered to take me on this journey chasing these Simbas who'd abducted these nuns, and they were cutting them to pieces with machetes on the way down as they were fleeing from us. And we caught up with them. There was goodness in Mike Hoare, but, you know, there wasn't much goodness in what he stood for, really. He was there for the adventure and the money. There was one mercenary Rhodesian, and I was sleeping in the same room, and he had a whole box of stuff, and I said, "Where'd you get that?" He said, "I've just blown the bank in town, but there was no money in it, unfortunately." And then halfway through the night I heard gunfire, and I woke up in a great sweat. This Rhodesian had got drunk and shot these 2 African boys who were doing all the laundry and the cooking for these mercenaries for breakfast. I remember looking at one of these poor black boys. He was about 12 years old, and his eyes were open. And I looked at the mercenary, and he said, "They asked for it." He said, "I found a weapon on them," which wasn't true. You know, some of these mercenaries, they just had a lust for killing Africans. I hated them in the end. When I came away from these atrocities, and I kept thinking, how am I going to get through this? I love what I'm doing. I love photography, but, you know, this other stuff is really too awful to live with, you know. And sometimes people used to say to me, "Do you have nightmares?" And I would say, "No, only in the daytime, when my eyes are open and I'm awake and my memory is, on full alert." So when I say I love photography, I love being in my darkroom, but even my darkroom is a haunted place. I go in there in that red light, it's like being in a womb, and I play the music, which is, it's only classical music. It somehow pleases me, but at the same moment, it takes me down and down and down to where I don't want to go. It's like as if I'm drowning in a very deep ocean. And I'm trying to get back to the top again to see the daylight. So, I don't just take photographs, I think. I would come back to Finsbury Park because unfortunately I was still living there in quite poor circumstances with my new wife. And then when there were odd days when I had nothing to do, I would go to the Wimpy bar and hang out with the same tribe, And then they would say, "Where have you been lately?" And I say, "Oh, I've been to the Congo with the mercenaries." And they would try to humour me, but basically they were almost putting me down, as if I was living in a water-mitty world. I did about 4.5 years on the Observer, and things were beginning to slow down for me, and I started getting the taste and the need to do much bigger, international stories. And a friend of mine called David King, who worked at the Sunday Times, said to me, "Why don't you come and join us? Why don't you come and do some work for us? I'll give you work." So I did, and he sent me off to the Mississippi. It was an amazing part of the world, the Mississippi. I mean, there you had the sharecroppers, the black people who, brought in the cotton, living in shacks and sheds. And then you had New Orleans, where we arrived in New Orleans. And it was amazing to see. A Ku Klux Klan rally one night. It was like Hollywood. There was the big firecross burning, these rather hateful people in these ridiculous kind of outfits smoking huge cigars, and basically saying welcome, but, at the same time intimidating us. I managed to, get a few pictures which David King, when I came back, put together. You can take amazing pictures, but you still need to have them presented in a way that the public can accept them and understand them. That was my first assignment for the Sunday Times.
Roy Thompson was not a journalist himself, but he was the best friend journalism ever had. He was very proud of his newspapers, and he was so proud of their independence. He had a card printed, which he carried in his pocket. So when Roy Thompson was attacked, "Why are your papers publishing this?" or "Why are you putting these war photographs in the colour magazine? We advertisers don't like it." He would pause and take out of his pocket a little card, and it said it was a kind of oath he'd made the newspapers that I control will always be independent and run professionally, and I do not interfere in them. So he'd put the card back in his pocket and he'd say, "You wouldn't expect me to go against my own word, would you?"
I was very privileged because I worked on the Colour magazine, which was directly associated with the Sunday Times newspaper, and I had equally wonderful people there who allowed me to just disappear and come back several weeks later, and on top of all that, allow me to edit my own material.
He knew he had the confidence that if he did his part and took his photographs and reported with integrity and accuracy and with a sense of composition, that it wasn't going to be interfered with or rejected because of some other concerns.
They trusted me, and so it meant that I would try that much harder for people who gave me this wonderful freedom.
So Roy Thompson, backing his editors, was crucial to the career of Don McCullin.
The 60s were packed with opportunities if you wanted to go to war.
Israeli soldiers, fresh from street fighting, snapped one another at the Wailing Wall. Pictures for girlfriends or mantelpieces in Tel Aviv.
If they think I've come back happy, they know that I've got something ghastly to show. And if I've got something ghastly to show, it means that I'm trying to get the message over to people that even though I like being in a war and I like being there because it's a great adventure for me, my duty is to be there for a reason, not just to have a bloody good time.
I covered the Battle of the Citadel of Way, which was the biggest battle I'd ever been in.
I mean, I wouldn't like to go through a year without being in a war.
And it went on for 2 weeks, and that was really the beginning of real madness.
I'm getting a bit bad, really, because I'm looking forward to doing 2 wars a year. And if I start looking forward to doing 2 or even more a year, I'm not going to survive.
Sleeping next to dead bodies, looking at men who'd been run over by tanks and who looked like Persian carpets in the road, people with their brains hanging out, living under tables and sleeping in rat-infested rooms. It was like basically going into total madness and insanity. I stood for 2 weeks in that battle, watching dozens and dozens of American soldiers being killed and wounded and being dragged towards me. They look as if they've been taken out of a butcher's shop with blood everywhere. In the end, I became totally mad, free, running around like a tormented animal.
Make sure that when they look at my pictures, if it's on a Sunday morning after breakfast, that it's going to hit them hard.
The very first man I saw in that Battle of Way had been hit in the face with 2 bullets, and he had a bandage round him. It looked like a child who had his porridge dripping down his face and through this bandage, but in fact it was blood and not porridge. It was big, gooey chunks of human gall just coming out of his face. And I put my camera up to my face, and he tried to move his head, this soldier, but his eyes were screaming at me not to photograph me. So I took my camera and went somewhere else. There was no shortage of human flesh to photograph that day.
My most vivid memories of the battle was that it was one of the most intense battles of the Vietnam War. Don came in and joined us, and he just kind of showed up. But what was unique about Don is that the other correspondents and photographers would show up and what I would say snap and go. They would take their pictures and then be out of there. Don, for whatever the reason, decided to join with us, stay with us, and for several days he became one of us. On one occasion, or actually on more than one occasion, went out at great risk to himself to assist in bringing some of our wounded casualties back to where we could evacuate them. His classic photo of the shell-shocked Marine is a Delta Company Marine.
I dropped on my knees and photographed this man. I shot 5 frames, each one singularly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's not one blink of an eyelid, there's not one change. All those negatives are exactly the same.
I have kept up with a sizable number of the Marines from Delta Company. We get together periodically, and that individual has not surfaced, so I don't know his history from that day on.
I photographed this giant American who looked like an athlete, but he was throwing a hand grenade. Within seconds, this sniper hit this soldier in the hand, and then he had a hand like a cauliflower. It was all busted and bursting open. The picture itself almost defeats the anti-war feeling that I was trying to put across, because he looks the picture of manhood, like a javelin thrower in an Olympic event. Instead of that, he was throwing a hand grenade which was meant to bring death to others. The one meaningful picture I took in that battle was a man who'd been hit in both legs, an American Marine. He was being supported by 2 friends. And if ever I thought at the very moment in my atheistic kind of mind that I was looking at something purely religious, was of this man who looked like Jesus Christ being taken down from the cross.
When it was over, about 50% of the Marines were casualties. In my own case, I went in with a company of 120 Marines and sailors, and at the end of the battle, there were 39 of us that were still standing. So you can see from just those shots how chaotic it was.
After 2 weeks, I got back to the press centre in Da Nang, and I realised I hadn't taken my clothes off, my underwear, anything off for 2 weeks. And, I had a beard and I was haunted looking. And I took those clothes off and threw them straight into the waste bin, my underwear, everything I stood in, and had a shower. I think I could have easily broke down in that shower and cried. You know, I was so drained and, you know, used and crushed by 2 weeks of seeing people dying. And, you know, I think what I'm trying to say here is trying to be honest. You know, photography suddenly didn't come into the picture even. It was, it had nothing to do with photography. After a while, if you're that involved in that kind of situation, it's not about photography, it's about humanity.
Still photographs do have this strong affinity with the way we remember, so and the vibrations of a still photograph can be intense and can last forever. I can remember Don sometimes worries, I know, about have I taken these risks, is it worthwhile? Well, I can tell him it is, because nobody can trace. It's like throwing a stone in a pond, the ripples go out. You can't say this ripple was caused by this stone. But they are, and I think the disenchantment with the Vietnam War in America was powerfully reinforced by some of the photographers, American photographers, including Don McCullin.
You know, photography is the truth if it's being handled by a truthful person. And I have to tell you that I have a lot of integrity. I would never tell a lie. I would never try to recreate something that wasn't real. I did a picture once where I did recreate something. It was only the only time I ever did it, but I saw some Americans looting the body of a dead soldier looking for souvenirs and mocking the body and mocking the person. And when they went away, having rifled all through his personal things, I brought them together and made a kind of montage of the pathetic possessions of this North Vietnamese soldier. It's the only time I've ever done it, but I thought I would make a statement for this soldier. I have no shame about doing that. I do have this picture, and I think it says what I was trying to make it say. You know, that, you know, hear me, I'm just, you know, a victim of war. That was, I was trying to say this about this young man. We had total freedom in Vietnam. That, of course, made the Americans feel, when the war finally came to an end, that it was the media that let them down. And they felt a bit upset about that because they'd given us every facility. And all they got in exchange was, you know, that public opinion turned against the war in Vietnam. So if you go to Afghanistan now, you're totally controlled. You're never going to be allowed to take the kind of photographs I did in Vietnam of the real thing, the battle, you know, the price of war and the suffering and the loss. So the whole rule book has been rewritten, and it doesn't come out in our favor.
You just said it's a rotten job, and yet you have in fact sought it out. You sought out war and famine and misery in all the time I've known you, which has been a long, long time.
Yes, but I did it because I thought it was just going to be soldiers. And then when I got to war, I mean, I thought it was amazingly kind of exciting to lay under a barrage of shells dropping on me or a sniper trying to get me. I thought, you know, that was a challenge, and I've swum around with many dead bodies in canals to get by them, and when the snipers were working a ridge for me, and I thought, you know, I wanted to put my fingers up and say, you missed it, mate. And, you know, I had a very cocky attitude about warfare. But then I started coming in contact with the real victims, and they are always the poor people who are not informed. They don't have the Mercedes-Benz to get away. They don't have the communication or the money to move off quick. They are always the very poorest people who get clobbered. And the amazing thing is that was where I started in my life, living with poor people. And when I am with them in those circumstances, I have a very close affinity and an understanding of what their lot is.
I'm sure you never noticed how much
Buddies, aren't you?
Well, we're all buddies.
Can you look where my elbow is? I want to see your face if you don't mind. That's fine. Oh, you're okay, aren't you? You don't mind? You don't mind me? I'm not bullying you around, am I? Okay, thanks. I don't want to take liberties, you know.
I could have spent the rest of my life working in Aldgate and Whitechapel. It's all there. Photographically, it's all there. It's a totally, what do they call it? Hogarthian kind of experience when you're doing these pictures there. This is one of my favourite pictures, and I've never, ever printed it before. And I look at this man's hands. They're all standing up asleep, these men. These people used to try and put the dead eye on you. By that, they try to stare you out, and you must never flinch away like that. You must stare them out. This is a woman called Jean. She used to hang out under the arches of Liverpool Street Station. She used to curtsy when I went up. She used to say, "Hello, Captain Mark." I said, "Why do you keep calling me Captain Mark?" She said, "Because you look like Captain Mark Phillips." And she said, "Would you like some tea?" And I said, "You haven't got any milk." She said, "I can always get it outside of people's front doors." I loved her. In fact, what I did, I found her somewhere to live. And this is the picture I really like. It's like a fallen woman from the turn of the century. I did this in Chapel Market, Sunday morning when I was a very young photographer. She's been a posh woman, this woman. Tell by the handbag, tell by the clothes. They're all young now. They're not all old people like this. I think one of the best portraits I ever did was this man in Spitalfield Market, and he was actually lying by the embers of an all-night fire that these homeless men used to congregate around. He sat up and looked at me full face, and I just held his stare, and I just brought my Nikon camera up to my eye and took this picture, and he never moved an eyelid. I was looking at the bluest eyes you'd ever seen, and his hair was matted. I felt as if I was looking at one of those Neptune images of a man under the sea, you know, with the trident. It was quite extraordinary. I'm so pleased with the picture.
This year, it's a matter of life and death. There's been a war going on in West Africa for 2 years now. It's a civil war between the Biafrans and the Nigerians. We're not going to say which side is right or which side is wrong, except that all war is always wrong.
I went 2 or 3 times. Aeroplanes that used to take in aid used to land on an extended road, which was their airstrip. It was called Uli Airstrip, and you went at night, and the federal government had hired, you know, Russian pilots and foreign pilots to try and shoot these planes down.
The next one is flying the other side of the mission church, sweeping to the right, scraping the ground as they move, dropping incendiary bombs and fragmentation bombs in the marketplaces around here.
So going into Uli Airstrip at night was a very hairy experience.
There are crews out there willing to fly, despite the lack of permission, and we'll just try and fly in.
But you stand a good chance of being shot down.
I don't think so, no.
They seem to have been fairly trigger-happy in the past, though.
Well, anyway, we're going to try, and let us see.
Miss Ryder, why are you going as well?
Well, because one feels very deeply concerned, clearly, with anyone who is suffering in distress anywhere. And partly because one has seen a situation in Europe in the past, perhaps similar to this.
Into a camp which was actually an old school building, and there were 800 dying children standing there waiting for me. You know, when you go into a camp with 800 dying children, some of whom were actually dropping down and dying in front of you, they think you're coming with some form of salvation. They don't realize you're coming to take pictures and get information. That's not what they want. You know, they want food. I saw this particular boy that haunts me to this day. He was an albino boy, and he was standing looking at me, barely managing to stand on his spindly legs. And when you're an albino in Africa, you're singled out all the time for bullying and God knows what. He was clutching a French corned beef tin, some previous aid gift, which he'd licked the interior completely dry. And I thought, I can't look at this boy. It was too much. He was staring on me. So I went somewhere else and spoke to a doctor, because another child had collapsed and was dying. And suddenly somebody touched my hand, and I looked down, and it was the albino boy. He was holding my hand. And I thought, well, why are you doing this to me? It was like he'd homed in on me, and he was really paining me. He was making me feel so ashamed. So I gave him a barley sugar from my pocket, and he went away, and he stood at a distance licking this barley sugar. There were children of 2 years old crawling around on their stomachs with their anus hanging up. I've never seen anything so terrible in all my life. The inside of their whole backside had kind of invertedly kind of suddenly fell out, and they were dragging themselves around with this inside-out situation of their bottoms, with flies hanging on as they crawled. I thought this was like worse than any inferno of insanity you could ever experience and see in your life. It wasn't real. It was so horrible, so shocking. And, you know, I almost became paralyzed. I was so shocked. I thought, take your mind off it, take some pictures. And they said, there's a girl you must see. And they said, her name's Patience. And they brought her in, and she was completely naked. She was 16 years of age, days, if not 1 or 2 days away from death. And I thought, how am I going to do this? And they sat her down, and I asked the nurse if she would place her hands over the lower part of her body. Because I thought, you know, if I'm going to do this picture to show this terrible, shocking creature, I'm going to do it with as much dignity as I can, you know, rustle up and at least not take advantage of her nakedness. You've never seen a more dignified person, you know, inches away from death. I remember one day seeing a woman trying to feed the child at the breast. There was nothing for the child at the breast. And I saw some writing in the back, the far distance. And after I had photographed the woman, who, believe it or not, was only 24 years of age, and she looked like 65, I went and read the writing in the far distance on the wall, and it had on the wall, "Today I am reborn." And that little inscription took my legs away from me. You know, you can go through so much as a photographer. You put yourself there. You don't ask, you don't ask, why you're there. You go there, and yet at the same time, you put yourself there. You could refuse if you want. I went there. But when I went there, I photographed these people to show they had more dignity than most of us will ever dream of. That being in the last throes of their life.
His awareness of the futility of it, as well as the direct sight of these people dying on their feet, moved him enormously. He always had the empathy, of course, for the soldier who was shot, but here he was looking at civilians, men and women without any clue about what was going on, dying because of the ambitions of some of the power-hungry people in that country.
You know, I was constantly at London Airport and waving goodbye from my little family. I was very eager, as always, and ambitious to get to the front of the fighting. And the next thing I know, that we walked into an ambush and then all hell broke loose.
There was tremendous heavy AK-47 fire.
And I immediately ran down into the side of the road, which is like a culvert.
And I thought, I'm going to get my tail out of here because, you know, what does one picture mean if I'm a soldier under fire? It's going to cost you your life. For the first time, my nerve went.
I knelt behind a jeep and there was an almighty explosion. I was blown across the road. I felt this terrible burning sensation in my legs and everywhere from the waist downwards.
And all my past seemed to come before me. I thought, this is it, I'm going to die.
So I crawled away for about 200 yards, only to be put on the back of a truck, having been stabbed with a morphine injection.
And then they filled the lorry out with about half a dozen soldiers who were wounded.
I thought, I'm going to take my mind off of my own pain. I'm going to photograph what's going on in this truck. And they put the man on the truck right next to me who took the full brunt of the mortar bomb that hit me, but he got, unfortunately, all of it in his chest and stomach.
And he kept sitting up and trying to fight people who were holding him down. He was fighting.
And he died on the way back in the truck to the hospital because I sat up and photographed him.
I said, I don't want to take any more risks. Well, they took the risks as they judged fit because they were independently minded, and if I secretly rejoiced that they brought back what they did. Nonetheless, the next time, and the next time, and the next time, you thought, pray to God, and they're not playing Russian roulette with their own lives here.
It was strange for me to get on an aeroplane, fly to Belfast, drive to Londonderry, check into the hotel, And you could guarantee that once the pubs turned out about 3-something in the afternoon, that there you braced yourself and you knew exactly where it would be. It was almost like a football match. You knew where the action would be. It was bricks and bottles and stones coming at the soldiers, who then fired rubber bullets and CS gas back. And I used to be gassed on a regular basis. But from a photographer's point of view, you couldn't miss. It was like a theatre, really. It was like a play. You knew the plot. You knew, you'd seen it many times before. I knew they were going to charge, and I was standing there with my short telephoto lens. And I took this picture of the "let's go and get 'em." I wasn't totally aware that in the shop doorway by this taxi company was a woman standing there holding her mouth with total shock. That made my picture much more poignant, really. I came upon this highway and I saw these dying soldiers in the road, and I was with a very nice friend of mine called Michael Nicholson, who was a ITV reporter. Their wounds were kind of melting into the tar itself on the road. They were so hot. We prized them off the road and we draped them across the bonnet of his Jeep. And I stood on the front of it and I kind of leaned on them, and we drove them back to a first aid medical centre for the army. And we went back the next morning to see how they were, but they died. And I did lots of pictures of men coming in on that road with pieces of cardboard around their feet, because they threw their boots away. And of course they didn't last long on that road. The whole thing was the most appalling shambles. It was like the retreat from Moscow. It was in total disarray. And so when the Sunday Times published these pictures, the South Vietnamese government put me on a blacklist, which I never thought for 1 minute ever existed. I was building this reputation as a war photographer, which today I really detest. I worked for it, and then when I suddenly felt that I was being acclaimed as a war photographer, suddenly I felt uncomfortable and dirty. I felt being called a war photographer was like being called a mercenary. Looking back on all that, I thought my family suffered very badly. I was always waving goodbye to them, and one wonders in their mind, were they ever thinking, will we ever see this strange man again who's supposed to be our father? But, you know, I didn't want to weaken my strength by thinking in a sentimental way. I wanted to do my job and then hopefully go home to them. But it was very selfish now I look back on it. And it eventually ruined my marriage.
Allied Christian stronghold of Fotografía, Phalangist militiamen poured fire down on neighboring areas held by Muslim leftists and allies from the more extreme Palestinian guerrilla group.
Every day had a twist in the Lebanon. There's always something, ghastly and new to kind of look at. You see, I did this photograph of all these Christians who are all proudly, showing their manly side to them. And the audacity was that they were wearing Christian crosses. And, you think, you expect more from Christianity if you're displaying it in such a way than some of the terrible things that they did in the name of Christianity.
On the political front, the situation still appears to be stalemate. Efforts to implement the ceasefire clearly having failed, and Parliament's attempts to hold a session to discuss what should be done.
The Palestinian area is called Quarantina. It's the kind of east side of Beirut, right inside the Christian heartland. And it was murder from the word go. They started, collecting prisoners, that it all happened so quickly. I went to a house where I could hear a lot of women and children screaming. A Christian was bringing the women and children down the side of this stairwell, and I could see two young Palestinian men with their hands up in the left-hand side of the stairwell. And the moment the women went out of the house, the man next to me, and I was very close, very close, started opening up and killing these people in cold blood immediately, and they went down in a hail of bullets and blood and all up the wall. And I went round the back of the stairwell, another stairwell, and tried to get a grip of myself because I was so shocked. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I came out of the building and there was another Christian gunman who had the women and children. He said, "By the way, if I see you taking any pictures, I'm going to kill you myself. Now get out of here." Everywhere I went that day, I could see another person being murdered in front of me. Of course, what I did eventually get this picture of the man playing the lute over the dead Palestinian girl's body. They were so angry about it when it was published that they said that if they ever caught the man who took this picture, they would kill him. In a way, it was almost an honor that they wanted to kill me for taking that picture.
The 26-story Holiday Inn is burning, the third of a trio of five-star hotels to be caught in the firing line.
This is the courtyard of the Hilton Hotel, and it was here that the fighting took place all last night.
When the Islamics overwhelmed part of the Christian area where I was with them, they were actually ensconced in the Hilton Hotel. And when they got in there, the Christians that they captured in there, they took them to the top floor and they mutilated them, like in a manly sense, by cutting off part of them. And they threw them alive off the top of the building. When it gets down to that kind of hatred, it becomes a form of insanity. It goes beyond your understanding of anything.
I don't know how he did it. He had a very sensitive conscience. I often call him a conscience with a camera. He had a very sensitive feel for other people's suffering. But it also gave him the impetus to feel, I can make people wake up to what's really going on here. So the sensitivity, which might have made him recoil from the images, was allied to this conscience of his, which says, I've got to get this story. This story can only be told by photographs. His journalism at its best when that cold eye of his, if you like, was informed by the warmth of his empathy and by the text which amplified the images that you could see.
It's an awful question to ask you, but do you think that the images you take of horror, of war, actually make anybody change their mind about it?
Well, actually, to be honest, I don't think they have. I've been photographing war for about 16 years, and I've got very disillusioned. And I've just had an exhibition, and the exhibition was mostly attended by very young people, and judging by the letters that I have received, which were many, the people who wrote to me were very young people, and they're the people who care about war. I think the rest of us, the middle-aged, hate to say this, people, they've had war, they've had enough of it, and I think that they're sick about hearing it now. They think there's no solution. But the young people, who are tomorrow's people, they're more interested in trying to do something about it. They feel ashamed of it and can't understand it.
Do you think you would ever, I mean, why don't you set up the easy life and earn 500 quid a day taking pictures of ladies wearing bras and things? Or not wearing bras?
But I'd probably get a heart attack, you see, or something.
Probably.
You like this one, the sulky lover? Yeah. You would be if you had a face like that up against you. This is one of my favourite pictures. I don't have many favourites. It's a classic example of intrusion, of course, but but it's just showing the English. The deck chair says it all, doesn't it? One thing about England, you can guarantee to find all kinds of kind of crazy people in the summer. There's not, I don't think there's a country quite like this country for the diversities of people's manifestations, you know, like eccentrics, you know, you can get them by the busload here in England. I love it.
When the print unions sabotaged the Sunday Times, they basically killed the paper. The Thompson organization said, we can't go on like this. We can't have the paper wrecked, not only physically, but economically. And so they put the paper up for sale, and they had a perception, a judgment, that Rupert Murdoch, with his history of being pretty tough, would be better able to control the print unions. And in some respects, that was a fair judgment.
Well, you've had enough photographs. I think we really...
And with Mr. Evans, Mr. Murdoch.
Oh. And though he made promises about the papers would maintain their independence, he did not keep them. And this, of course, was very, very bad news for British journalism, but it was also bad news individually for Don McCullin.
When Murdoch took over the Sunday Times and Harold Evans, I think, went to the Times newspaper, we all felt that, you know, we were looking at the beginning of the end. And I had 18 fantastic years there.
The precious independence that he'd had and the ability to go and tell an unvarnished truth through the medium of film was now at risk. And so it proved to be.
The Falklands War suddenly appeared on the horizon, and I thought, I want to be in on this because for the first time in my life I'm going to be in a big international war with British soldiers. You know, I thought I was the natural person, and to my astonishment I was barred. It didn't happen. I was left behind, and I was utterly miserable and devastated.
It was an appalling decision to keep Don McCullin off the boat on the crazy excuse that the boat was full. It seemed to be saying, your photography is so honest, so searing, so implicit with meaning, we can't take the risk of you exercising freedom of expression. I thought it was the most appalling decision, and its effect on him was to seem to say, you've spent your life documenting things we don't think you should ever have documented, which of course was saying, why have you bothered? Why have you bothered to risk your life to try and tell the truth?
And that's the reason I went back to Lebanon, because I didn't go to the Falklands. The Lebanon war was erupting at the same time. So, you know, I could always go somewhere else. If I couldn't go to this war, I could go to another war, you know, because I was suffering from what you become, a war junkie, really. I was suffering from that problem, you know.
The massacres were carried out by an elite special security formation of the Lebanese Christian Phalange. The operation was, at all stages, under direct control of senior Phalange commanders. During that early stage of the massacre at Shatila camp, the Israeli forces fired a constant barrage of flares to light up the camp for the Phalange forces inside.
One morning in the hotel very early, I had a call from someone saying, "Are you Mr. McCullin?" I said, "Yes." He said, will you come down to the lobby? We want to take you to the hospital in Sabra and Shatila. And they said, look, 21 people have been killed in this hospital. But we're not interested in that. We want to show you the worst aspect of what's happened here today. And they took me upstairs to the children's department of the insane side of the hospital. And to my astonishment, there was one nurse who'd stayed for 5 days during this shelling. The others had fled the hospital. And she showed me around, and I couldn't believe what I was looking at. She said, we've had to tie the children to the beds. She said, because we couldn't cope, you know, they would have got away and been injured. And there were children tied to the beds, covered in flies, in a heat you wouldn't understand. So these children were lying in buckets of their own filth, starving hungry, dying of thirst. And she said, oh, there is a room with more children. I've had to lock them in the room, and they're blind and they're insane. And she said that they're only 2 years old, some of them. And she opened the door of this room, and the heat that came out of it, you could have roasted a chicken in it. And out swam in their own filth and mess, and they were like blind rats, these children. And I don't think I was ever more ashamed of humanity. I thought, if this is what people can do in the name of, you know, Christianity or whatever, you know, because, you know, the war was being conducted against the Christians and the Christians were fighting back and the Jews were shelling offshore. I mean, you know, the whole thing was about religious madness and who was paying the price. And, you know, I wandered away. I was in a deep shock and I thought, I'm confused here. You know, why am I here? What's this got to do with my original concept of being a photographer? And I wandered into another room just to get away from all this horrible, horrible stuff. And I saw a child sitting, playing with bits of debris, as if he had Lego. I think it was a day of reckoning for me, because I don't think I could have ever touched on more tragedy, all under one roof, than what I saw in that hospital that day. I've never forgotten it. The sad thing about these days that I never forget is that they come back on a regular basis, as fresh as it was happening today, to haunt me.
There's nothing so powerful as reporting. Governments can't find out the things that reporters can. And certainly many governments wish to suppress what can be found out, foreign governments and sometimes our own. So this is a very, very important quality of Don's impulses, which is the passion to report what's happening. And insofar as that's diminished today, we've lost a huge amount. And I think there's still a tremendous appetite for really good photojournalism, really good reporting.
Mr. Rupert Murdoch, on Budget Day, asked me to resign as editor of the Times. I refused. At no time have the independent national directors sought my resignation. But in the circumstances, the differences between me and Mr. Murdoch should not be prolonged. I am therefore resigning tonight as the editor of the Times.
The reason I got pushed out of the Sunday Times was simple, actually. They brought a new editor in, a man called Andrew Neil, who was very ambitious and quite you know, he knew what he wanted. You know, most new editors like to kick off with a new bunch of people under them. But he did say that there would be no more wars in the magazine. And in fact, it would be a magazine based on life and leisure, you know, to attract the ads. So, you know, I was one of the first casualties, because when I went and photographed wars in Africa and saw dying and starving children, I was going to make sure that, you know, I got the strongest images, and that they didn't always sit well in a magazine that was trying to sell you, you know, cars and luxury. So, you know, I was definitely on the way out by that stage.
I asked him about the occasion he was invited to an execution in Saigon, and as I recall, he went to the prison where the execution was going to take place and then just turned back and refused to take the photograph. Because of his really powerful humanitarian impulses, he didn't want to legitimize murder in any way, since actually his entire canon of photography is to delegitimize violence, to say, look, these are the consequences of your political decision. These are the consequences of your greed. These are the consequences of your carelessness. Look on these and think again. I think there's the entire impulse. A humanitarian photographer with tremendous technical skill amounting to genius, in my view.
I'm nearly 75 years of age now. I still have some energy left, not a lot, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to eradicate, you know, the things we've been talking about. I'm just going to photograph the landscape, and the English landscape to me is my heaven, my form of heaven. The one thing that upsets me about it is, like all other things, there is always a threat surrounding the things you love. When I hear a chainsaw in the distance here, I think a tree is dying. When I hear shooting, when there's pheasant shooting, I think there's going to be some blood somewhere. The sound of gunfire immediately switches on another part of my nervous system. So I feel, as much as you try to run away from these things, someone always presses a button and says, you know, here's a reminder of, you know, what you used to do.